Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you to our first Brown Bag webinar of the new year. And this is with our own Juanita Barrera, who's based in Bogota, Colombia. Her work with EarthShift Global is primarily focused on life cycle assessment studies for a range of our clients. She holds a Master's of Science degree in Industrial Ecology from the Universities of Leiden and Delft in the Netherlands, where EarthShift Global's Senior Sustainability Advisor, Valentina Prado, was her thesis supervisor. Juanita's background includes evaluation of alternatives to recovering chromic acid from the water used for the production process of tin-free steel and potential water reuse in the production cycle, and many projects related to the calculation of the global warming potential of biogenic carbon flows. She's also worked on projects for quantifying impacts and benefits related to land use change. So thank you for being with us today, Juanita, and welcome.
Thank you, Holly, and thanks all for being here. As Holly just mentioned, my name is Juanita Barrera Ramirez. I'm a sustainability analyst at EarthShift Global. With my colleague and teammate Valentina Prado, we applied life cycle assessment and a set of socioeconomic indicators to identify the trade-offs of the substitution policy in Colombia, but also we quantified the environmental and social impacts of this policy. I will turn off my video just to save a little bit of bandwidth. So in 2016, the Colombian government and the oldest guerrilla in Latin America, FARC, signed a peace treaty after almost 50 years of armed conflict in Colombia. The illicit crops, mainly coca, were considered as the principal fuel of the conflict, as the FARC became involved in the illicit drug business in the 90s as a way to finance its operation and the conflict itself. The peace treaty, the Colombian peace treaty, contemplates 6 principal points, being one of them a substitution policy that offers financial incentives and social incentive to the coca-growing communities to replace illicit crops by illegal alternatives. In 2015, so 1 year before the peace treaty was signed, these 2 regions of Colombia, the Catatumbo region and the Putumayo region, have more than 30,000 families involved in the coca cultivation and processing of the coca leaves to produce coca paste and cocaine. This year, in the Catatumbo region, more or less half of the land had presence of coca cultivation, coca crops, and in Putumayo, a quarter of the land had coca crops. This, as Holly mentioned, this research was my thesis research, and we developed this in 2019, was published in the Journal of Industrial Ecology. So you can download the paper and see all the details of this research. And the purpose of this study was to assess environmental and socioeconomic trade-offs of the implementation of the substitution policy in the Putumayo and Catatumbo regions. This is a complex topic, so some of the causes of the coca cultivation were not taken into account in the LCA, such as the deforestation and the land use change, and also the impacts related to biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity because of the land use change and because of the presence of coca cultivation in these areas. Also, we did not consider some components of this substitution policy, such as the infrastructure, the education programs that were considered, the mobility, and also we did not consider the changing conditions or agreements that had happened since then. The implementation of a policy like this raises the question about the trade-offs of on environmental, social, and economic terms. For example, if legal crops such as coffee, cacao, and sugar cane, that were the ones that we consider for this study, represent the same income as the illicit crops for the farmers and for the communities that were involved in this. And also, if replacing coca crops by cacao, sugar cane, and cacao have any beneficial benefits for the environment. So because it's so important, this substitution policy and the magnitude of this, it was our goal to identify the consequences of its implementation. So the purpose of this study was to assess this, the environmental impact, so calculating the impacts of the coca cultivation for producing cocaine and as compared to legal crops, and also the socioeconomic trade-offs of this replacement. So for the environmental assessment, we apply life cycle assessment, defining as a function to provide an alternative to the coca harvesting regions of Colombia through the implementation of the substitution policy. The system boundaries defined for this study were cradle to gate. So for the cocaine production, we consider the cultivation of the coca leaves, the processing of those for the extracting the alkaloid, and the purification to produce cocaine. And for the legal crops, for cacao, sugar cane, and coffee, we consider the same system boundaries. So we consider all the cultivation stage for the coffee, the dried of the beans. For the illicit crops and its processing, the data came from the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. At that time, the most recent data was for the year 2015. I have to say that the United Nations collect all this data on site, so it's primary data, and we use the impact assessment CML 2001 baseline. For the socioeconomic analysis, we include 4 indicators. So being the first one, the income for farmers, the other, the income for jornaleros. And here is important to understand the difference between farmers and jornaleros. So the jornaleros can be considered as the daily workers, and they get paid by jornal, so per day, per days of work. And the farmers are the ones that are in charge of the land. That doesn't mean that that they are the owners, but are in charge of the land, of the crop, and also they are in charge of the laboratory or kitchen, as is called by them, to process the coca leaves and obtain first the coca paste and then the cocaine. The jornales, as I mentioned, is the workforce demand, so the number of days that the jornaleros work, and also we include the market value for all for alternatives, the legal and the cocaine, just as a point of comparison. This is the process for making cocaine. So to produce cocaine, the coca leaves are harvested. This is done by hand. Then those leaves are chopped and mixed with a range of chemical precursors as cement, urea, lime, gasoline, sulfuric acid, and others that are needed to extract the cocaine alkaloid from the coca leaves. As you can see in those pictures, people that handle herbicides and those chemical precursors don't use protective clothing and are exposed to those chemicals, and also to excessive working hours because the jornaleros get paid by the amount of coca leaves that they can collect in one jornal, in one day. Also, all the waste that is generated from the cocaine production just goes directly to the nearest water bodies and also to the surroundings. And here is important also to mention that from 1 hectare of coca cultivation, between 3,700 and 5,400 kilograms of coca leaves are collected. And from that amount of coca leaves, between 5 to 7.6 kilograms of cocaine are obtained. As the implementation of the substitution policy is not just like black and white, it's more a multifaceted challenge and is conditioned by the availability of financial resources, the influence of the stakeholders, the dynamics of drug trafficking chain in the regions. We explore 3 scenarios. We propose 3 scenarios for the Catatumbo and the Putumayo region. The first one, the one in green, is the business as usual scenario. This scenario reflects the situation before the peace treaty was signed. So this scenario examines the socioeconomic characteristics of coca farmers, jornaleros, and also in this scenario, the environmental impacts of coca cultivation and cocaine production was quantified. The second scenario, the policy success, is an optimistic scenario. In this, 100% of the coca crops are replaced by, in Catatumbo, cacao, the blue color, and coffee, and in Putumayo by cacao and sugar cane. This means that all the goals that were set in the substitution policy are met, and all the coca farmers and the jornaleros that were involved in this decided to replace the crops and migrate to legal alternatives. Then we have a third scenario. There is the balloon effect scenario. In this scenario, 60%, a significant percentage of the coca farmers joined the substitution policy. However, the drug trafficking, as we all know, is a lucrative and attractive business, and the demand for cocaine remains. And this caused displacement of the coca crops to new land. So in the Catatumbo, 46% of the coca crop is displaced to new land, and in Putumayo, 26%. And this land would be assumed that this land was never being used for this purpose. It's virgin land in this sense. Now moving to the LCA results, what I found is that the agricultural practices are different in both regions, are different between the Catatumbo and Putumayo region. And this is reflected on the yield of coca leaves that are harvested per hectare. That's what we saw before in the flow chart, that there is a range on coca leaves per hectare, and it's just because the agricultural practices on each region. For today's, we select 3 out of the 9 categories that we explore in the research, and what we can see here is that replacing coca crops to produce cocaine does not mean that there is going to be a decrease or that will mean an advantage on environmental terms. We can see for climate change, the impacts are almost the same. For acidification, the impacts go higher, and then resource depletion will mean an advantage. So there are trade-offs when considering these replacements. And then the balloon effect scenario in almost all the categories has the higher impact. And this is quite obvious because more land is taken, so more agrochemicals are needed, and also more chemical precursors. The acidification goes up as compared to the business as usual because of the use of fertilizers, the quantity and the type of fertilizers that are needed for the coffee crops. But this can be mitigated or can be reduced by applying silvoforestry practices, and also reducing the proportion of the coffee in the policy success scenario, because in the study we assume half-half, so then they can play with this proportion. Then in the Putumayo region, we observe a similar trend as in the Catatumbo. There are some trade-offs between the business as usual and the policy success scenario, and the balloon effect has the largest impact in almost all the categories that we explore. The toxicity categories, as the human toxicity, are as compared to in the policy success as compared to the business as usual, increase because of the quantity and the type of pesticides that are needed for the sugar cane. But this can be reduced by modifying the type of pesticides. And in the acidification impact category, is the impact goes up as compared to the business as usual because of the type of fertilizers that are needed for cacao and sugar cane. So it's important for us to keep in mind that changing on environmental terms, that replacing coca leaves to produce cocaine is not per se like one, doesn't mean that it will reduce the environmental impacts. There are some trade-offs. Then moving on to the socioeconomic results, the 4 indicators: the net income for farmers, income for jornaleros, jornales, and market value. What we see here for the Catatumbo region is that replacing coca crops by cacao and coffee, so the policy success, reduces by almost 30% the total income for farmers, and also reduces the salary for the jornaleros. and the balloon effect, there are no major changes in the income for farmers, and it will reduce the income for jornaleros. However, the total of jornales needed in the policy success will increase, meaning that more workforce will be needed. Then moving to the fourth indicator, the market value, between the profit that is produced by the cocaine will be reduced between 40 and 50%. But we have to keep in mind that this profit has been used by the guerrillas to finance the war in Colombia, while trading cacao, coffee, and sugar cane most probably will boost the regional and the national economy and help the consolidation of the peace treaty in all these areas. Then in the Putumayo region, what we see is that the net income for farmers is comparable between the business as usual and the policy success. However, for the jornaleros will increase, and also the total of jornales. And the market value, as in the Catatumbo region, will be reduced. But again, important to keep in mind that the legal money will boost the economy, and that this is the transition that we are aiming for in Colombia. These two regions in Colombia, unfortunately, had the presence of guerrillas and coca crops, but it's important to mention that these two regions are one of the most biodiverse places in the world, and is the home of a lot of animals, and is surrounded by a lot of rivers, and those are beautiful places. So it's just important also that this transition will mean a lot of good things for Colombia and for the people that live in there. Then moving to the conclusions and remark, when setting one policy as the substitution policy, it's important to consider the particularities of each region, the dynamics of the illegal chain, because as we saw, the yield of the coca plantation is different in both regions, and also prices of agrochemicals and chemical precursors. So in general, it's important to study the substitution crops that are economical, socially, and environmental suitable for each of the region. We need to consider the characteristics also of the land. LCA and other environmental assessment methodologies can help to identify the potential impacts and avoid burden shifting when considering this type of policy, when considering the type of crops for substituting coca crops. And also just something that I wanna share is that 1 kilogram of cocaine produces more or less 600 kilograms of CO2, so 600 times its weight of CO2, and this is equivalent to the emissions produced by driving 2,500 kilometers. This study can help to inform about the environmental impacts of drugs, mainly of cocaine, and for this policy to be successful, for us to see the policy success scenario be reached, there is important that synergies are established between the private sector, NGOs, and the farmers, for making sure that the legal crops have a market. and the farmers can get paid for that. And also is important to provide technical assistance for the farmers for migrating from the illicit crops to legal economies. Muchas gracias. Thanks a lot. Questions and comments are welcome.
Thank you, Juanita. I have several questions from our audience here, and the first one says, this is really interesting, Juanita. Were the emissions from dumping the coca production wastes included in the assessment?
Yeah, we include the impacts of dumping all these like gasoline and all these chemical precursors to water bodies. We calculate that and include that in the study.
Okay. And was fair trade coffee and
Cacao.
Was fair trade coffee and cacao considered, and what would be the difference between fair trade and conventional crops?
We include conventional crops in this study. We did not consider like fair trade, and for this there are some practices that need to be met. What I can mention here that I forgot before is that there are already some cases, some successful cases where the cacao from farmers that were cultivating coca before now cultivate cacao, and this cacao is used in Belgium, and there is one brand, there is cacao for peace, and it comes from these farmers.
Nice. Could there be an optimum legal crop mix for either of the areas that would be mostly a win-win replacement?
What we saw in the study is that cacao is the most favorable crop in terms of economic, social, and environmental impacts. So replacing 1 hectare of coca by cacao is the most promising. However, the cacao takes at least 5 years to reach the maturity stage, so the production stage. So in these 5 years, there is the need to have other crops to make sure that farmers have income.
So kind of as a follow-up to that question is why sugarcane, cacao, and coffee were considered as the substitution crops?
Because those were already used in previous programs by the Colombian and other NGOs in Colombia, and those are suitable for the Catatumbo and Putumayo regions.
Okay. And someone else says, thank you, Juanita. Very interesting talk. You mentioned the very high biodiversity of the region. Were you able to evaluate the different potential biodiversity impacts for each scenario?
No, though the biodiversity impacts were not considered on the study. That can be like a follow study. Next
Okay.
step.
And how have your findings been received by the UNODC?
They, like right now, that we are working with them to include those findings in the world report that they do every 2 years. So to inform more people about the environmental impacts of coca crops in Colombia.
Okay. And I see someone who says, bananas are often grown in conjunction with cacao. Did you look at including banana production? And if not, why?
We include just the crops that I mentioned, and I know that cacao often grows, if is grown with banana to have this cash flow, but we just focus on one crop that was cacao, the main one.
Okay. What are some key aspects of the drug production that are not considered here?
Land use change. We did not consider the impacts of deforestation because, as I mentioned, these two regions are one of the most biodiverse regions in Colombia. We did not consider that deforestation and biodiversity loss.
Mhm. And what would you say is the main source of uncertainty or variability in your data?
I think for the cocaine production, there is no one single recipe, if I can say that.
Mhm.
So we work with what it was available, but since this is not a legal activity, there is a lot of variability on the type and quantity of chemical precursors that they use to extract the alkaloid.
So one more question for you here, and what was the biggest challenge of this research?
I think the biggest challenge was to get the data from UNODC because a lot of this data was not published at the time that I was developing the study, but we managed to do an agreement and to get all this data in order to calculate the impacts of the illegal chain.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your very interesting and informative talk. To see all those photographs really helps put it in perspective too. Um, so thank you and great work. So happy to have this research out in the world. All right, so I'm going to end this talk.
Thank you.